YouTube. YouTube never changes. Since the dawn of humankind, when our ancestors first started complaining about Mass Effect 3's ending, to that time we spelled Gesamtkunstwerk wrong, to that time we started talking about Michael Jordan for some reason, our species has sought the answer to one simple question. What the hell does Shandification mean? Part 1. What the hell Shandification means. Some of you may not be familiar with this word. I mean, how could you be, considering I made it up? The word is a reference to the title of one of my favorite books, Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Stern. Tristram Shandy is one of the weirdest books ever written. It isn't weird because of its subject matter. Like many books from its period, it's mostly about the day-to-day mundanities of life in the English countryside. What makes it weird is its structure. The entire book is essentially a collection of rambling tangents, kind of like my videos. No wonder I'm a fan. It's not a particularly famous work. A collection of lunatics did try to make a movie out of it a while back, and against all odds they actually did a decent job. But for the most part the book doesn't get much attention, mostly because it's so weird that no one really knows what to make of it. Of course I know what to make of it, and I'm going to tell you. In order to understand the book we should look at its author, Lawrence Stern, and the literary world he inhabited. In the 18th century, the Western world was in the midst of a cultural movement that we now call the Enlightenment. This movement filtered through almost every part of society and brought with it a gradual change in literary conventions that we now collectively refer to as realism. This change didn't culminate until the 19th century, but you can find its formative stages before that, and Tristram Shandy is one of the places in which you can find them. Since we've now reached the part of the video where I start oversimplifying things for the sake of explanation, let's examine what this change in literary conventions looked like. Part 2. I hope you like diagrams. Let's diagram a story. A story is a sequence of events. A happened, then B happened, then C happened, then D happened, and hopefully these 4 events have some kind of dramatic arc. If you were to ask an ancient Greek tragedian why these events happened, he would most likely tell you that they happened because of fate. Classical drama was preoccupied with the concept of fate, and frequently used it to give their stories both order and meaning. Now let's take this same story out of the 5th century BC and bring it into the 18th century AD. Ask an Enlightenment thinker why these events happened, and he or she would most likely tell you that they happened because of causality. D happened because of C, which was caused by B, which was caused by A. To the 18th century mind, reality is not a divine mystery, but a chain of cause and effect that can be empirically understood. However, this chain isn't telling the whole story. B didn't just happen because of A, it most likely had multiple causes, like E and F. For that matter, A didn't happen on its own, but was caused by G and H. C also had multiple causes, as did E and F and G and H, and this is quickly getting out of hand. Now you can see why classical playwrights would be tempted by the concept of fate as a dramatic device. It's not as though the ancient Greeks didn't understand cause and effect. They weren't stupid. They just believed, and perhaps hoped, that hidden in the majestic complexity of nature was some kind of unknowable cosmic order, because the alternative is frankly kind of frightening. By contrast, a modern author conceives of his or her job as being the separation of signal from noise, even if he or she concedes that the distinction between the two is often arbitrary. Either way, the act of storytelling is the act of selective exclusion, of artificially imposing order on the unmanageable chaos of reality. This concession is practical. The audience is not likely to want to hear a story that's constantly going in 6 different directions at once. They want an understandable journey to a tangible destination. Plenty of books and plays and movies have been written with a plot that looks like this, but who in their right mind would try to write something with a plot that looks like this? I'll tell you who. Lawrence Stern, that's who, and the book was called Tristram Shandy. In theory, the book is about the life story of its eponymous main character. In practice, it's an exercise in continuous distraction as the narrator spends the whole time providing us with the voluminous backstory of his own life. Tristram Shandy is more than just an entertaining book, though it is that, and it's more than just a meta-commentary on its own medium, though it's that as well. It's an insightful look into how stories are told, and, just as importantly, how stories are personalized and used to create a sense of self. Which brings me, finally, to what Shandification means. A Shandified story is one where the narrative is free to move in its own direction and at its own pace, in a setting well realized enough to allow for this freedom of movement. If Lawrence Stern had been alive today, then he probably would have been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. But he also probably would have been a gamer, because no other medium in history has had greater potential for shandified narratives. Part 3. Right, I know, I haven't forgotten, but I have to talk about something else first. So games, be they electronic or tabletop, have great potential for telling a personalized story. Have PC and console games been taking advantage of this? Some of them, yes, but too many of them have been moving in the opposite direction. Over the past 5 years or so, a mostly unchallenged consensus has emerged in the world of game development that games should try to be cinematic. Cinematic as in like movies. On one level, this makes sense. People like movies, and film, along with its close cousin television, was the last new visual medium to win mainstream acceptance as an art form, acceptance that games are often self-conscious about not yet having. What's more, movies are good at telling visual stories. It makes sense to crib their best ideas, right? Sure, copy the polish and nuance of cinema, but also be aware of where this comparison breaks down. Because movies, when compared to games, are a much more regimented and controlled experience. When you watch a movie, you're seeing exactly what the filmmakers want you to see, in exactly the order they want you to see it. But games are usually characterized by some level of freedom on the part of the player. And if you give players any freedom, very often the first thing we'll do is stop cooperating with your story. We'll do everything in the wrong order. We'll ignore all the things you wanted us to notice all of the things you never even thought about, and generally lay waste to whatever dramatic structure you wanted us to experience. In short, we'll make like Tristram Shandy and cheerfully surrender to every distraction we come across. And this is a good thing. Because when we're allowed to wander aimlessly throughout the story, we can create a convincing sense of self within that story, and thereby create a more personal connection to it. Let me give you an example. The first part of Mass Effect 1 is a mostly linear combination of exposition and tutorial. The game doesn't really open up until after this conversation with Udina. After this scene, you walk out of his office and you're free to roam around for the first time. The first time I ever played the game, I knew from the map that in order to reach the next objective and progress the story, I should turn left after leaving the office. So of course I turned right, because that's how I do. I walked into a side room and struck up a conversation with these two funny-looking things. While talking to them, I found out what their personalities were like, what they were proud of, and what they were frustrated about. From their codex entries, I found out that this guy is a Volus, and he wears that funny-looking suit because he comes from a planet with a different kind of atmosphere. I found out that this guy is an Elcor, and he comes from a planet with unusually strong gravity, so strong that just tripping over a rock or something might be fatal, circumstances that understandably led to their culture becoming very cautious and conservative. This bit of dialogue represented the first opportunity I had to poke the world of Mass Effect with a stick, and to wander around it, flipping over its rocks to see what was underneath, and everything I found was full of creativity and soul. Looking back, I suspect that the few minutes I spent in this random side room talking to these two random weirdos were what sold me on the entire series. I was hooked from then on in. But what if Mass Effect had been more cinematic? What if it had actually been a movie instead of a game? This scene and its accompanying codex entries would have been the first thing cut for time. Let's bust out my sloppy MS Paint diagrams again. Here, it's possible to describe A, B, C, and D as the story, and everything else as the setting. In a linear narrative, like you'd find in a book or a movie, setting details are only included when they're directly relevant to the story. Any irrelevant ones will have a hard time justifying their presence in the text. But as a story becomes less linear, as it becomes more shandified, the distinction between story and setting begins to dissolve. The setting becomes the story, and vice versa. Keep this in mind as I finally start talking about the ostensible subject of the entire video. Part 4. Now that the video is more than halfway over, I might be able to squeeze in some discussion of the Fallout series right here at the end. Specifically, I want to compare the last two entries in the series, Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas. This is a useful comparison precisely because these games have so much in common. They're both open-world RPGs, made by developers experienced in that genre. They both take place in different versions of the same setting, they both use the same engine, and they both have the same overall style of gameplay. And they were both good games that received generally positive reviews. If they have so much in common, then why is it that I thought Fallout 3 was merely good, while I thought New Vegas was one of the best games I've ever played? You can probably see this answer coming a mile away, but here it is anyway. the world of New Vegas was more effectively Shandified. I'll demonstrate what I mean by asking an obnoxious and repetitive question. A question I often ask when exploring fictional worlds. That question is this: what do they eat? Here's Megaton, one of the first places you visit in Fallout 3. It's got a cool shantytown look, a distinctive layout, some memorable characters, but I can't help but wonder, what do they eat? I don't see any farmland around. They use these two-headed cow things as pack animals, but they don't seem to raise them for food, and it doesn't seem likely that this many people could have survived this long by scavenging canned goods from the local ruins. So what do they eat? Oh well, continuing on. Now to explore the post-apocalyptic ruins of our nation's capital, a memorable combination of grandeur and decay, populated by grotesque and hostile creatures. I wonder what they eat. I mean, I guess they eat people, but there can't be that many people wandering into the DC ruins, not enough to feed all of them. If you're a super mutant behemoth, I bet you really have to pack in the calories to maintain that kind of muscle mass, especially if you're living the high-activity lifestyle that comes with attacking everyone you see with a club made out of a fire hydrant. But I guess they get by somehow. On to Rivet City. Cool concept. A settlement built in a derelict aircraft carrier. Only I have to ask, what do they eat? Again, I don't see any farmland or livestock around, and I can't imagine fishing in the deadly irradiated water is a good idea. So what do they eat? Do you find this question annoying? Some people find it annoying. For some people, the answer is, who cares what they eat? What is this, the Discovery Channel? This is a video game, not a nature documentary. But in my opinion, if you find this question annoying, then you are not cut out to create fictional worlds. Remember, you're working in a medium where the setting is the story, which means that a question like what do they eat is part of the story. Let's look at Fallout New Vegas now. The first place you visit is Goodsprings, a sandy little burg that fits well with the game's southwestern theme. But let me ask you something. What do they eat? They're in the middle of the oh. This guy is growing corn or something in his yard. And they're also raising these big sheep-looking things. And they get fresh water from the spring the town is named after. Alright, fair enough. That's fine for a small town like Goodsprings, but what about a big city like Vegas? You can't eat blackjack tables. How are you going to feed the entire population of a city big enough to... Oh. I see you have, like, an entire complex of farms, complete with irrigation and greenhouses and stuff. So I guess that's what they eat. Fallout New Vegas has thought these questions through, and the game's attention to detail doesn't just extend to matters agricultural. It extends to matters social, commercial, political, and even psychological. Everything in the game's world makes sense, from the behavior of the tribes living on the outskirts of Vegas, to the machinations of Benny and Mr. House, to the naked expansionism of Caesar's Legion, to the thinly disguised expansionism of the NCR. All of it rings true. This reveals a contrast in the approaches of Bethesda and Obsidian. To Bethesda, Fallout's setting was a secondary concern, an environment in which to put gameplay. The question of why anyone would build a town that isn't next to a food source but is next to a live, unexploded nuclear bomb was not as big a concern for them. But to Obsidian, the setting was part of the story, to the point where it's not even clear where one stops and the other starts. This means that I can wander more freely around its complex web of cause and effect without running into an immersion-damaging contrivance. Both games were good. I played Fallout 3 and enjoyed it, but only once. I never put in the frankly embarrassing number of hours I put into New Vegas, and the key difference between the two games is the quality of their Shandification. It's this quality that makes the personal story I created while playing New Vegas more plausible and therefore more enjoyable. And it's this quality that more developers should be trying to emulate. Question and answer section. Question 1. So what do Deathclaws eat? I only ever see them around other Deathclaws. The answer is everything. Deathclaws eat everything. Question 2. Have you played the Leviathan DLC yet? What did you think of Stop. I haven't played Leviathan yet. I might play it someday. Until then, I'm avoiding spoilers. Question 3. What's the next one going to be about? Violence. And talking. It'll make more sense when you see it. Question 4. Is this basically the end of the video? Yes. Basically.